This week, we'll be looking at the arguments of Kant's first and second analogies of experience that concern the concepts of substance and cause. Before we look at these arguments in detail, though, let's think about Kant's general question of how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. At A158, B197, Kant tells us that with the transcendental aesthetic and the transcendental deduction completed, we have the general answer to the question of how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. Kant explains that while what makes analytic judgments possible is the principle of non-contradiction, and what makes synthetic empirical judgments possible are particular experiences, what makes synthetic a priori judgments possible are the conditions of the possibility of experience. So, by showing that space, time, and the categories are conditions of the possibility of experience, Kant has explained how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. Space, time, and the categories are a priori representations, since they're the forms of our faculties of sensibility and understanding, and yet they relate to objects, since, as Kant writes, the conditions of the possibility of experience are at the same time conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience. Now, while the transcendental aesthetic and transcendental deduction help us understand how, in general, synthetic a priori knowledge is possible, what we want to understand now is, in particular, what synthetic a priori knowledge we're entitled to have. What does our synthetic a priori knowledge consist in? What judgments can we make about objects, independently of any particular experiences, on the basis of the conditions of the possibility of our experience? In the first analogy, Kant aims to display our right to the judgment that all change is the mere alteration of substance which persists. And in the second analogy, Kant seeks to display our entitlement to the judgment that every alteration is governed by the law of cause and effect. Now, the way Kant's arguments in the analogies proceed is by identifying an empirical judgment we have the right to make about the temporality of our experience, and showing that this empirical judgment presupposes a synthetic a priori judgment, employing the concept of substance or of cause. In the first analogy, which concerns the concept of substance, Kant articulates this empirical judgment by writing, "All appearances are in time, in which, as substratum, both simultaneity as well as succession can alone be represented." So the premise here is that we can judge that certain appearances are simultaneous, while other appearances are successive. The first question in interpreting the first analogy is what simultaneous and successive mean in this context. Kant's second premise in this argument is that we can distinguish simultaneous and successive appearances only if we already have a piece of synthetic a priori knowledge. That is, only if we already know that in all change of appearances, substance persists through that change, and the change of appearances is merely the alteration of that substance. To understand what Kant's first premise means, let's think about two sorts of changes in our experience. In certain cases, two objects exist at the same time, and our experience begins with the one and then changes to the other. So for example, suppose there's a frog and a log that both exist for a half hour. For the first 15 minutes, I attend to the frog, and then my attention shifts to the log for the next 15 minutes. In the first 15 minutes, when I'm attending to the frog, the log exists, though I'm not attending to it. And in the second 15 minutes, the frog exists, even though I'm not attending to it. This is what Kant wants to call experience of simultaneity. There are two objects existing simultaneously, even though my apprehension of these objects is successive in the sense that first I observe the frog, and then I observe the log. The other sort of case, which Kant calls succession, is when I observe a burning log for 15 minutes, for example, and then I observe its ashes for the next 15 minutes. In this case, the objects are not simultaneous. The ashes don't exist when the log exists, and the log does not exist when the ashes exist. Here, it's not my attention that shifts from a log to ashes, but it's the object itself that changes from being a log to being ashes. Now, Kant takes for granted, in the first analogy, that we can draw this distinction. Of course, there are some cases where I misidentify a successive existence as a simultaneous one, and there are some cases in which I misidentify a simultaneous existence as a successive one. If I don't know much about the life cycle of butterflies, I might mistakenly think that someone has replaced my caterpillar with a butterfly, when in fact, the caterpillar has become a butterfly. Of course, we make these sorts of mistakes, but Kant's claim is that it's at least possible for us to get it right. It's at least possible for us to distinguish experiences of simultaneous appearances from experiences of successive ones. So the question Kant asks is how, on what basis, can we draw this distinction in principle? Now, Kant points out that it can't be on the basis of our apprehension itself that we draw this distinction. Kant writes, "Our apprehension of the manifold of appearance is always successive. We can therefore never determine from this alone whether the object of experience is simultaneous or successive." So the thought here is that if I look at the log, look away, and then look back and see a frog, It's not obvious from the looks of things that the log didn't turn into a frog. And by the same token, if I look at a log, look away, and then look back and see ashes, it's not obvious from the looks of things that the log turned into the ashes. Kant also notes that we cannot perceive time by itself. Why is this relevant? Or what does it even mean? Kant's thought here is that while the objects of our experiences are always in time, we can't experience an object's temporal history in experiencing that object. So while I can see a heap of ashes now, I can't see the temporal history of that heap of ashes when I'm seeing the ashes. When I'm seeing the ashes, I can't see that 15 minutes ago, these ashes were a log. By the same token, if I'm looking at a frog right now, I can't see that this thing has been a frog for the past half hour. If I could see everything's temporal history in the moment that I see the thing, then on this basis, I could distinguish simultaneity and succession. But of course, we can't do that. So something else must stand in for time. And now Kant's claim is that substance is what stands in for time. Kant writes, "It is in the objects of perception, that is, the appearances, that the substratum must be encountered that represents time in general, and in which all change or simultaneity can be perceived in apprehension through the relation of the appearances to it." He continues, "The substratum of everything real is substance, of which everything that belongs to existence can be thought only as a determination. Or alternatively, only in that which persists are temporal relations possible. That is, that which persists is the substratum of the empirical representation of time itself, by which alone all time determination is possible." So Kant's thought here is that the way I represent a succession in the objects of my experience, as opposed to a mere succession of my experiences, representing simultaneous objects, is by representing the former case, the case of a succession in the objects of my experience, as an alteration in an underlying substance. So the idea is, I can represent the log as changing into ashes, as opposed to the log being replaced by ashes, by representing a substance persisting that underlies the log and the ashes both, such that the change from log into ashes is merely the alteration of this underlying, persisting substance. Now, Kant gives two other arguments in the text of the first analogy. So if you want to write your paper on Kant's first analogy, you might try to reconstruct these arguments and consider how they relate to the argument I just presented. One of these arguments concerns duration. So Kant writes, "Only through that which persists does existence in different parts of the temporal series acquire a magnitude, which one calls duration. For in mere sequence alone, existence is always disappearing and beginning, and never has the least magnitude. Without that which persists, there is therefore no temporal relation." Now, time cannot be perceived in itself. Thus, this persisting thing in the appearances is the substratum of all time determination, consequently, also the condition of the possibility of all synthetic unity of perceptions, that is, of experience. So while in the first argument I presented, it's our empirical knowledge of simultaneity and succession that presupposes our synthetic a priori knowledge that substance persists. On this argument, it seems to be our empirical knowledge of duration that presupposes our synthetic a priori knowledge that substance persists. The third argument that Kant appears to give in the text of the first analogy concerns the unity of time. Kant writes, "If you assume that something simply began to be, then you would have to have a point of time in which it did not exist. But what would you attach this to, if not to that which already exists? For an empty time that would precede is not an object of perception. But if you connect this origination to things that existed antecedently, and which endure until that which arises, then the latter would be only a determination of the former, as that which persists. It is just the same with perishing, for this presupposes the empirical representation of a time at which there is no longer an appearance. Substances, in appearance, are the substrata of all time determination. The arising of some of them, and the perishing of others, would itself remove the sole condition of the empirical unity of time." So in this passage, Kant seems to give an argument that the unity of time is possible only given the presupposition that substance persists through time. So again, if you choose to write your paper on the first analogy, you might consider whether this is a good argument and how it relates to the main argument Kant gives regarding our empirical knowledge of simultaneity and succession. Now, Kant's second analogy concerning the concept of cause builds on his first analogy in a way. Having shown that all change is the mere alteration of a substance which persists, Kant now aims to show that all alteration is governed by the law of cause and effect. His argument in the second analogy has the same general form as his argument in the first analogy. Kant seeks to identify a piece of empirical knowledge and show that that empirical knowledge presupposes some synthetic a priori knowledge. While in the first analogy, Kant's first premise was that we can distinguish simultaneity from succession. In his second analogy, Kant's first premise is that we can distinguish objective and subjective succession. Kant begins by writing, "The apprehension of the manifold of appearance is always successive. The representation of the parts succeed one another. Whether they also succeed in the object is a second point of reflection, which is not contained in the first." So while in the first analogy, Kant asked us to consider how we can have knowledge of succession and not mere simultaneity when our apprehension is always successive. Here in the second analogy, Kant's asking how we can have knowledge of objective succession as opposed to merely subjective succession when our experience is always successive. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what's the difference here between objective and subjective succession? Kant offers two examples. They're the examples of a house and a ship. Kant writes of the house, "The apprehension of the manifold in the appearance of a house that stands before me is successive." Now, the question is whether the manifold of this house itself is also successive, which certainly no one will concede. Kant explains, "My perceptions could have begun at its rooftop and ended at the ground, but also could have begun below and ended above. Likewise, I could have apprehended the manifold of empirical intuition from the right or from the left. In the series of these perceptions, there was therefore no determinate order that made it necessary when I had to begin in the apprehension in order to combine the manifold empirically." This contrasts with the case of seeing a ship driven downstream. Kant explains that in this second case, my perception of the ship's position downstream follows the perception of its position upstream, and it's impossible that in the apprehension of this appearance, the ship should first be perceived downstream and afterwards upstream. The order in the sequence of the perceptions, Kant explains, is therefore here determined, and the apprehension is bound to it. Kant marks this distinction by calling cases like the ship being driven downstream happenings or occurrences. So Kant's premise in the second analogy is that we can have empirical knowledge of happenings or of occurrences, where to have empirical knowledge of a happening is to have a determinate order to one's apprehension. So in the observation of a house, nothing happens, because I could first observe its rooftop and then its foundation, or I could first observe its north facade and then its west facade, or just the same, I could first observe its foundation and then its rooftop, or I could first observe its west facade and then its north facade. In my observation of a house, nothing happens, which is just to say, the order of my various apprehensions of the house is not determined. The order of my apprehending the house could proceed in one way just as much as in the opposite. But when I observe a happening or an occurrence, this is not the case. In the case where I see a ship driven downstream, I first observe the ship upstream, and then I observe the ship downstream, and it couldn't be the opposite. I couldn't observe first the ship downstream, and then the ship upstream. Now, just as in the case of the first analogy, Kant's not saying we never mistake happenings for non-happenings, or non-happenings for happenings. All Kant is saying is that it's at least in principle possible for us to get it right. We can distinguish the case of observing a happening from the case of observing a non-happening. We can draw the distinction between a determinate order of our apprehension from an indeterminate order. And as in the case of the first analogy, the question is how this is possible. What enables us to draw this distinction between happenings and non-happenings? What gives us a right to claim that we've observed a happening as opposed to a non-happening? As in the argument of the first analogy, Kant points out that there's nothing in our apprehension itself, in the qualities of the objects apprehended, that enables us to draw this distinction. Kant writes, "Every apprehension of an occurrence is a perception that follows another one. Since this is the case in all synthesis of apprehension, however, the apprehension of an occurrence is not yet thereby distinguished from any other." So the thought is, when I'm observing the house's north facade and then its west facade, I know that I could just as well observe its west facade and then its north facade. But this knowledge isn't grounded in the looks of the house's north and west facade. There's nothing in my apprehension of these two facades that indicates their order is indeterminate. And just the same, in apprehending the ship upstream and then downstream, there's nothing in the look of the ship upstream or in the look of the ship downstream that indicates that my apprehension had to come in this order as opposed to in the opposite order. Now, Kant's claim is that what justifies me in judging that something happened is connecting two states of an object in accordance with a rule. He writes, "The connection must consist in the order of the manifold of appearance in accordance with which the apprehension of one thing, that which happens, follows that of the other, which proceeds in accordance with a rule. Only thereby can I be justified in saying of the appearance itself, and not merely my apprehension, that a sequence is to be encountered in it, which is as much to say as that I cannot arrange the apprehension otherwise than in exactly this sequence." Kant concludes, if, therefore, we experience that something happens, then we always presuppose that something else precedes it, which follows in accordance with a rule. Now, of course, the rule Kant has in mind here is the law of cause and effect. So Kant's idea is that I represent the order in my apprehension of the ship upstream and then the ship downstream as a determined order by representing the actual ship's location upstream together with the current as the cause of the ship's actual location downstream. As Kant puts it, in this case, I derive the subjective sequence of apprehension from the objective sequence of appearances. The succession of the ship upstream and then the ship downstream in my apprehension is a determined succession precisely because the ship upstream and the current is the cause of the ship downstream. By contrast, the way I'm able to represent the order of the north facade and the west facade of the house in my apprehension as indeterminate, such that the west facade could have come first and the north facade second, is by not representing any rule-governed causal relation between the north facade and the west facade of the house. Now, this is meant to provide an argument against Hume, since it's meant to show that a piece of empirical knowledge that Hume would acknowledge we have isn't possible except on the presupposition of our synthetic a priori knowledge that every occurrence stands under the law of cause and effect, which Hume supposes we don't have. So the question that you should consider if you choose to write your paper this week on Kant's second analogy is how well you think Kant's argument refutes the Humean skeptic. So in particular, would the Humean grant Kant's first premise that we can distinguish objective from subjective succession? And if so, is Kant right that the only way we can distinguish objective and subjective succession is by representing objective successions as governed by the law of cause and effect? A worry is that Kant's first premise lays claim not to empirical cognition, but to synthetic a priori cognition. When Kant draws this contrast between objective and subjective succession, he says, in cases of subjective succession, the series of perceptions had no determinate order that made it necessary. So does Kant think that in the case of objective successions, there's a necessity to the order of my apprehensions? If so, is this an illicit assumption in an argument against Hume? After all, Kant claims that necessity is a mark of the a priori, so you should consider whether Kant has illicitly snuck synthetic a priori knowledge into his premise in the second analogy. Another question you might want to consider if you write your paper on the second analogy is what the relationship is between the second analogy and transcendental idealism. Specifically, does Kant think that there's an argument from the premise that we can distinguish objective and subjective successions to the conclusion that transcendental idealism is true, that is, to the conclusion that our knowledge is of appearances only and not things in themselves? Kant seems to suggest as much when he writes, if appearances were things in themselves, then no human being would be able to assess from the succession of representations how the manifold is combined in the object. So in this passage, Kant seems to be suggesting that if the objects of our possible experience were things in themselves, then we could never know that a particular experience is the experience of a happening, or in other words, that there's an objective succession or a determinate order of our states of apprehension. So in writing your paper, you might consider the force of this argument. Is Kant right that the transcendental realist can't account for empirical knowledge of objective succession or empirical knowledge of occurrences? And if Kant is right, is that a good argument against the transcendental realist? A final passage you might consider is the reservation that Kant brings up at A202, B247. Kant's reservation is as follows. So far, Kant has suggested that the law of cause and effect governs objective successions. The reservation is that we seem to have causal knowledge in cases where there's no succession, but rather where cause and effect are simultaneous. Kant's examples here are a stove heating a room and a ball leaving an indentation in a pillow. Here, Kant admits that there's no lapse of time between the ball resting on the pillow and the pillow being indented by the ball. Yet Kant insists that here there is an order of time without a lapse of time, and that the order of time is still governed by the law of cause and effect. So in your paper, you might consider what this could possibly mean. What is the distinction between an order of time and a lapse of time that allows Kant to explain how causes can be simultaneous with their effects?